I still remember the moment everything started to go wrong. It was just another quiet winter morning on my little farm in Cedar Hollow, Oregon, the kind of place where nothing ever really changes and you start to trust that it never will. Then in less than a week my barn was underwater, my neighbors stopped listening to reason, and I learned just how fast, peaceful country living can turn into a war over dirt and gravity. My name is Ethan Miller. I've lived on this land for 15 years. It's not big, just a few acres with a red barn sitting low in the valley where the runoff naturally gathers before sliding into the creek behind my property. And for all those years I never once had a drainage issue, not in spring storms, not in winter floods, not even when the snow melted all at once and everything turned into a river for a day or two. The land just handled it the way it always had long before I showed up. The neighbors next door were the Harpers, Daniel and Marcy Harper, newer owners who moved in maybe 2 years ago, the kind of people who cared a lot about appearance, clean lines, manicured grass, a backyard that looked like something out of a magazine more than something that belonged to the Oregon woods, and I never had a problem with them at first. We'd wave sometimes, short conversations about weather, normal stuff, nothing that hinted at what was coming. Then one morning in late November, I woke up to the sound of engines I didn't recognize, not tractors from my side of the fence, but heavy construction equipment. And when I stepped outside, still half asleep with coffee in my hand, I saw trucks lined up along the property line, a crew unloading steel forms and concrete panels, and Daniel Harper standing there like he owned the whole valley, pointing and giving directions like my land didn't exist beyond what he needed it to be. I walked over and asked what was going on, trying to keep it calm because in rural places you learn early that tone matters more than words. And he barely looked at me when he said they were putting in a retaining wall, just something to level out the yard, make it cleaner, prevent erosion on their side. He said it like it was already decided, like the land had already agreed to it without bothering to ask me. I told him straight that I didn't care about their landscaping, but they needed to be careful about drainage, that my barn sat downhill, and all the water from both properties naturally funneled through that low point before reaching the creek. And I remember Marcy laughing a little like I was overthinking it. She said it was just a wall, not a dam, and that modern construction handled all that stuff automatically now. And then Daniel just shrugged and said they were paying a contractor who knew what he was doing, so I shouldn't worry. Over the next week, I watched that wall go up piece by piece, tall gray concrete stretching along the line like a scar cutting through the natural slope of the land. And I'll admit there was a part of me that started to feel uneasy even before anything went wrong, because I know how water behaves out here. It doesn't care about property lines, it doesn't care about intentions, it just follows gravity and finds the lowest point every single time. The first real storm hit about 10 days after they finished construction. Nothing unusual for the season, heavy rain, steady wind, the kind of night you sleep through if everything is working the way it should, but I didn't sleep much that night. Something about the sound of rain on metal felt different, sharper, almost like it was hitting something it shouldn't. Around dawn I walked out to the barn, and before I even opened the door I knew something was off. The ground felt wrong under my boots, soft in places that should have been firm, and when I pulled the barn doors open the smell hit me first, damp wood, wet soil, and when I looked down I just stood there for a second trying to understand what I was seeing because the entire floor was covered in water, not a puddle, not a leak, but standing water about 3 inches deep spread across everything. Like the barn had become part of a shallow pond overnight. I remember just saying no out loud, like that would somehow reverse it, and then I started checking everything. The doors, the foundation, the roof, trying to convince myself it had to be something simple, but I already knew the truth before I admitted it. The water wasn't coming from inside the barn. It was coming from everywhere outside, redirected, trapped, and pushed straight into the lowest point like it had been guided there on purpose. I walked next door that morning still in my work boots, not even bothering to change, and when Daniel opened the door I told him his wall had flooded my barn. I said it as calmly as I could, giving him the benefit of the doubt, expecting at least a pause, maybe concern, but instead he just leaned against the frame and looked past me like I was talking about a problem that didn't belong to him. Marcy stood behind him with her arms crossed and said it wasn't their issue, that they had hired professionals, that I should probably look into installing a sump pump if I was worried about water accumulation. And I actually laughed a little because I thought she had to be joking, but she wasn't, and Daniel just added that they had invested a lot of money into that wall, and it was staying exactly where it was. That was the moment something shifted, not anger exactly, more like clarity, because I realized they didn't see this as a shared landscape anymore. They saw it as separate problems, and mine had nothing to do with them. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the water sitting in my barn, about years of natural flow suddenly cut off by concrete and ego, and somewhere around 3 a.m. I started digging into county drainage regulations, not because I wanted a fight, but because I needed to understand if what they did was even allowed. And that's when I found it, buried in technical language, but clear enough once you read it twice. Any construction that alters natural water flow is required to maintain proper drainage or provide an approved outlet, meaning if you redirect water and cause damage downstream, you are responsible for correcting it. I remember sitting there in the dark scrolling through the document thinking this wasn't just bad planning. It might actually be a violation, and I had a choice: file a complaint and wait months while my barn stayed flooded every time it rained, or handle it myself before the next storm rolled in. By morning, I had already made my decision, and I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about control, because out here, if you don't control the water, it controls everything else. And that weekend, I decided I was going to give it a new path they wouldn't be able to ignore. If you want to see how that decision turned into something neither of us could take back, by the time Saturday came around, the air already felt like it was holding its breath, heavy clouds sitting low over Cedar Hollow like the sky was waiting to see what I'd do next. And I didn't tell anyone what I was planning, not because it was secret in some dramatic way, but because I knew how fast words travel out here and how quickly intentions get twisted into stories people repeat without ever checking facts. I rented a trencher from a hardware yard about 40 minutes away, nothing fancy, just a work machine that smelled like diesel and old dirt. And when I brought it back onto my property, I remember slowing down for a moment at the sight of that concrete wall the Harpers had built, still looking new, still clean, almost proud of itself in a way that felt insulting now that I knew what it had done beneath the surface. I started on the first stretch just inside my fence line, careful not to cross even an inch into their property, because I wasn't interested in giving them anything easy to point at later, and the machine tore into the ground with that deep grinding sound that only earth-moving tools make, like the land itself is being unzipped. I worked for hours that first day, guiding the trench along the natural slope, following the same path water had always taken before it got interrupted. And as I dug, I kept thinking about how invisible all of this usually is, how most people never think about where water goes until it shows up somewhere it shouldn't. By late afternoon, I had a long, narrow cut running almost the entire length of the wall, and I stopped only because my hands were shaking from vibration and I realized I hadn't eaten anything since morning. That night, I didn't sleep much again, not because I was angry, but because I kept running the system through my head like a puzzle I was trying to solve correctly, not aggressively, just correctly. Because if I got it wrong, I'd just be swapping one problem for another. The next day, I came back with plastic lining, gravel, and perforated pipe, and that part felt almost quiet compared to the digging, like the project was shifting from force to structure. I laid the liner carefully, pressed it into the trench, then filled it with gravel that clicked and settled into place like it already knew what it was supposed to do, and I made sure the slope was consistent the whole way down. No dips, no hesitation points where water could stall and back up. When I installed the 6-inch drainage pipe at the far end, I remember pausing for a second, just looking at it, because that piece felt like the turning point, the moment where I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was deciding. I angled it toward the lowest natural exit point on the land, which unfortunately also meant toward the Harper's side of the slope, but I didn't change the geography. I didn't raise anything. I didn't block anything. I simply gave water a continuous route again, the same route it had always tried to take before the wall interrupted it. When I finished, I walked the length of it once more in silence, checking every section, and I remember thinking how strange it was that something so simple could feel so final. The first storm after that didn't look any different from the others. Same gray sky, same steady rain, same wind pushing through the trees like it always did, but I stayed up longer that night, sitting near the barn door listening. Around midnight, I went out and stood in the dark, and for the first time in weeks the sound of water near my barn didn't feel wrong. It felt normal again, like the land had finally stopped fighting itself. In the morning, I walked inside and everything was dry, completely dry, not even damp in the corners, And I just stood there for a while letting that reality settle in because I hadn't realized how much tension I had been carrying in my body until it was gone. Later that afternoon, I saw Daniel outside near the fence line, looking toward his backyard more than toward me, and I could already tell something had changed on his side even before I got close. He didn't say anything at first, just watched the ground like it was betraying him, and I could see small pools forming where there hadn't been any before, slow at first, then spreading in a way that didn't match the neat yard they had built. Marcy came out a few minutes later, and the look on her face wasn't confusion anymore. It was irritation sharpening into concern, and that's when Daniel finally walked over and said, not asked, said that I had done something to the water. I told him I didn't do anything to their property. I just restored a drainage path that had always existed, and he shook his head like he didn't want to hear technical explanations, like facts were just another opinion in the way of what he wanted to believe. The second storm hit 3 days later, and that's when everything escalated in a way none of us could ignore anymore. My barn stayed dry again, but their backyard turned into something else entirely, not instantly a disaster, but slow and inevitable, water collecting against the base of the retaining wall, saturating the soil they had just laid down, turning clean grass into heavy mud that held every footprint like it was keeping records. I watched from my porch that evening as Daniel and a couple of guys from the neighborhood started trying to dig small channels with shovels, not engineering anything, just panicking in real time, trying to move something that was already too big to argue with. At one point, Marcy walked over to the fence and yelled that I was deliberately flooding them, that I had engineered the whole thing to get back at them. And I just stood there for a moment before I answered because I wanted my words to land properly, not emotionally. I told her water doesn't care about intentions. It cares about slope and exit points, and that if they wanted to change where it goes, they needed to change more than just one wall. She didn't respond after that, just stared, and I could tell she didn't like that answer because it didn't give her someone to blame cleanly. That night, I printed out the county drainage code, highlighted the sections I had read before, and kept it in a folder just in case things went further, because at that point I already knew they would. By the end of that week, they had officially contacted the county, and I had a feeling the inspector would be the one to decide what happened next, not either of us, no matter how much either side thought they were right. The county inspector showed up on a cold gray morning that felt quieter than the days before it. Like even the land knew something official was about to happen, and I remember seeing the white truck pull up slowly along the gravel road, stopping right near the fence line where all of this had started. His name was Robert Hale, mid-50s, clipboard in hand, the kind of guy who doesn't talk much until he's already formed an opinion, and he didn't come in with assumptions, just questions, walking the property like he was reading the ground more than listening to either of us. Daniel and Marcy were already outside waiting for him, and I could tell they had rehearsed what they were going to say, how they were going to frame it, because the moment he arrived, Daniel immediately started talking about intentional diversion, damaged landscaping, and malicious redirection, like he was building a case in real time. I just stayed quiet at first, leaning on the fence post, watching Robert crouch near the drainage area where my trench system connected, watching him trace the slope with his eyes the way someone does when they're trying to see what was there before anything was built. After about 20 minutes, he stood up, brushed dirt off his hands, and asked to see the construction permits for the retaining wall. That's when the energy shifted. Marcy hesitated. Daniel tried to explain that their contractor handled everything, that permits were in process, but Robert's expression didn't change. It just tightened slightly in that way people do when they already know the answer but still need it said out loud. He walked the entire length of the wall, tapping sections, checking the base, then looked at the backyard where water was still pooling from the last storm, not catastrophic yet, but clearly not draining anywhere it should. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost disappointingly calm for them. He said the wall had altered natural surface flow without a documented drainage plan, and under county code that wasn't just a design issue, it was a compliance violation. Daniel tried to interrupt, saying I had redirected everything toward them, but Robert raised a hand and asked him to let him finish, and that silence hit harder than any argument. He explained that when you change elevation and block a natural runoff path, you inherit responsibility for what happens next, and that responsibility doesn't move with intention, it moves with physics and law combined. Then he looked at me briefly and said I had not encroached or crossed property lines, which mattered, because everything I had done stayed within legal boundary and simply restored flow continuity. That was the moment I saw it fully register on Daniel's face, not anger first, but disbelief, like he had been expecting the world to side with effort over consequence. The official notice came a few days later, requiring the Harpers to install a proper drainage system with a culvert and regrading plan approved by the county engineer, and part of the retaining wall had to be removed to restore safe runoff capacity. I didn't celebrate when I heard that. There wasn't really anything to celebrate, just a strange sense of closure, like a system correcting itself after being out of balance for too long. The work on their property took weeks, loud machines again, sections of the wall coming down that once looked so permanent, replaced with pipes and channels designed this time to respect the slope instead of fighting it. One afternoon, Marcy came over alone while Daniel was gone, and she didn't look angry anymore, just tired in a way that made the whole thing feel smaller than it had in the beginning. She said they never thought it would actually cause damage, that they just wanted a nicer yard, and I told her I believed that part, but intention doesn't stop water from moving where it's supposed to go. She didn't argue, just nodded and walked back without saying much else. When everything was finally finished, my barn went through another storm without a single drop inside, and I stood there listening to rain hit the roof the way it always used to before all of this started, steady, predictable, almost peaceful again. The Harpers eventually fixed their yard, but the relationship between our properties never really went back to what it was, because once you understand how easily the ground can be changed, you don't forget it. Sometimes I still see Daniel looking over from his side when it rains, like he's checking whether nature has forgiven him yet, and I don't know if it ever really does. So I'll leave it with this. If you were in my place, would you have tried to fight it through the county from the start, or done what I did and let the land prove the point on its own? And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor situation that spiraled like this, I want to hear it, because out here, every piece of land has a story. It just depends who's willing to tell it honestly.